Today, we're going to talk about the Navajo people. Diné is what the Navajo people call themselves. Monument Valley, Antelope Canyon, Canyon de Chelly National Monument, Four Corners Monument. All of these highly visited places have something in common, and guess what? They're all on the Navajo Nation. We meet a lot of Navajo people at these famous tourist destinations. Today, we're going to talk about their history. Like other Native Americans, the Navajo people came to the Americas from Eurasia across the Bering Strait more than 13,000 years ago, when sea levels were low. For a long time, they lived in what is now Canada. Between 1100 to 1500 AD to the land where they live today. The Apache people, who are located further south, are believed to have moved in around the same time. The Navajo people believe their land is bounded by four mountains that they consider to be sacred mountains. The four sacred mountains are Blanca Peak to the east, San Francisco Peaks to the west, Mountain Hesperus to the north, and Mountain Taylor to the south. This is also known as the Four Corners area, where the four states of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah meet. In other words, the Navajo people have lived in the Four Corners area between the four sacred mountains for over 500 years. Other indigenous peoples have lived in the surrounding area as well. To the south are the Apache tribes, who came down from Canada around the same time, of which the Mescalero Apache called ND. The Navajo or Apache were originally hunter-gatherers when they lived in the Canadian region and before. Now the land they had reached was also inhabited by farming natives. The hunter-gatherer Navajo were quick to pillage the farming natives. The farmers were called Anasazi by the Navajo, which means enemy, which hints at the relationship between the two groups. The Anasazi civilization was followed by the Pueblo tribes. And the Pueblo would fall under the influence of the Spaniards, who came to the land in the 16th century. The Spaniards, who had called the land of Mexico New Spain, now called the area where the Pueblo had settled New Mexico. The Navajo plundered the Pueblo and New Mexico Spaniards. But they also adopted some of their agricultural practices. Peach trees were especially prized by them. The Navajo also raised livestock, such as sheep. Especially when the Pueblo Revolution of 1680 temporarily ousted the Spaniards. Many of their horses were brought over to the Navajo, evolving them into a horse-riding people. A Navajo house is called a hogan. Initially a simple hunter-gatherer lifestyle, the hogan evolved into a more settled lifestyle with the introduction of agriculture. Here's a hogan on display at Canyon de Chelly National Monument. You can even peek inside. This continued until the first half of the 19th century. Then in 1821, Mexico gained independence from Spain. Around 1824, the New Mexico annexed the old New Mexico. The Navajo tribe, many of whom lived around Canyon de Chelly, came into conflict with the Mexicans. In 1835, the Mexican army launches a military campaign against the Navajo. The Navajo army, led by a Navajo leader named Narbona, surprised the Mexican army at Chusca Mountain and won a major victory. The area where the battle took place was named Narbona Pass, after Narbona. Bigger changes were to follow. James Polk, who became President of the United States in 1845, believed that the United States should expand westward to reach the Pacific Ocean. The primary target was Mexico. Eventually, in 1846, the U.S.-Mexican War broke out. American people also appeared near the land where the Navajo people lived. The Navajo called them New Men. Narbona makes a peace agreement with the Americans. Mexico was the enemy of the Navajo, and the United States was the enemy of Mexico, so they figured that the United States was the enemy of the enemy and the enemy of the enemy could be their friend. The 1846 treaty, named the Bear Springs Treaty, reflected Narbona's idea that peace was just as important as war. However, the treaty was not agreed to by all Navajo chiefs, especially the hardliners, who saw the United States as just another enemy. In 1848, the U.S.-Mexican War ended in a U.S. victory, and the United States gained vast tracts of land, including New Mexico. And now American soldiers are moving into Navajo land. In 1849, having marched as far as Canyon de Chelly, the U.S. soldiers asked the Navajo for peace talks, hoping to build a fort nearby. Narbona wants peace and goes to meet with the U.S. soldiers. But at the peace talks, tragedy strikes when a misunderstanding arises and many Navajos, including Narbona, are killed. This gives the Navajo hardliners a boost. Narbona's son-in-law, Manolito, and another Navajo chief, Barboncito, were among them. The U.S. military had built and garrisoned a fort called Fort Defiance at the bottom of Canyon de Chelly. Led by Manolito and Barboncito, the Navajo warriors raided and fought against the U.S. Army in several locations, sometimes negotiating, sometimes not. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, the U.S. military was even forced to abandon Fort Defiance. But the U.S. Army would soon return as a stronger opponent. Fearing that the Confederacy would take over New Mexico, the North sent troops. This creates friction between the Navajo tribe and the U.S. military. General James Carleton wants to repair Fort Canby, formerly Fort Defiance, and show the Navajo the power of the U.S. military. The right man for the job is Christopher "Kit" Carson. Ordered by Carleton to crack down hard on the Navajo, Carson tenders his resignation, only to be overruled and sent on his way. What a start! Kit Carson gets things done. He launched Operation Scorched Earth. He burned down Navajo homes and crops and slaughtered their livestock. The Navajos went into hiding in Canyon de Chelly and held out. However, when Navajos see Carson cut down all 2,000 of the peach trees they had grown, they were horrified and demoralized. Navajo leaders like Manolito and Barboncito knew it was time to back down. For the Navajos who surrendered, the ordeal was devastating. Carleton ordered them to move 300 miles away to a place called Bosque Redondo, near Fort Sumner. James Carleton said Bosque Redondo had good water and was suitable for farming, so he told them to go and live a farming life. He also told them to embrace Christianity. Anyone who disobeyed would face immediate military action. Eventually, the Navajo people were forced to migrate. It's called the Long Walk, the same Trail of Tears that happened to the Cherokee tribe in the southeast decades ago, but on western lands. Trip Across visited the Bosque Redondo Memorial. This museum tells the story of the Long Walk. The Diné have come a long way. 50 groups made the journey on 7 different routes. And around the same time, the Mescalero Apache to the south, the Ende, were forced to move to the same place. In the long hallway, a painting depicting the tragedy of the Long Walk is also displayed. Children and elderly people with no shoes are struggling to walk. People were being left behind and people were dying. In addition to deaths from malnutrition or disease, many people lost their lives. One pregnant woman stopped walking to give birth, but people were not allowed to help her. Even her parents were forced to leave, and soon, they heard gunshots behind them. They never saw their daughter again. More than 200 Navajos died during the Long Walk. American soldiers are watching over them with guns pointed at them. It's being recreated as a tapestry. The road was just the beginning of the tragedy. It was ironic that the biggest problem at Bosque Redondo was the water, because Carleton had convinced the Navajo that the water at Bosque Redondo was good. Not only was it not good for drinking, it wasn't good for farming. On top of that, the Pecos River's water was always jagged. Even the U.S. Army says water is terrible. Let's listen to Lieutenant Pettis for a moment. Water is terrible, and it is all that can be had within 50 miles. It is full of alkali and operates on a person like castor oil. Take the water, heat it a little, and the more you wash yourself with common soap, the dirtier you will get. There is nothing to eat because farming is difficult, and people are dying of starvation. Children would find grains in the feces of their animals and pick them up and eat them. It's hard to live, so they escape. Older people stayed behind and pretended that people were still in the camp. The families scattered and fled, hoping to save at least one person. Of course, they were chased and recaptured. People kept dying, and what started out as 10,000 people was down to about 6,000. The Navajo people looked forward to returning to the land they had left behind. The words of Barboncito, their leader at the time, echo their sentiments. Our coming here has been the cause of so much death among us. We have done all that we could possibly do, but have found it to be labor in vain. This ground was not intended for us. Before I am sick or older, I want to go and see the place where I was born. I want to go and see my own country. Even the Americans had to admit that they could not leave the Diné and Ende in Bosque Redondo. Once they became self-sufficient, they would have to be supported, and the cost of that support alone was enormous. At the end of the Civil War, James Carleton was eventually removed. And Civil War hero William Tecumseh Sherman came west with a negotiating mandate. Coincidentally, William Sherman's middle name, Tecumseh, is the name of a famous Native American leader. William Sherman's father gave him the name so that he would be as brave as Tecumseh. When William Sherman came to Bosque Redondo, he quickly realized the gravity of the situation. Now Navajo had to go somewhere else. William Sherman thought about sending Navajo to Oklahoma. It was a land that was already heavily settled and populated with Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee, and other indigenous peoples who had been forcibly removed from the southeast. It was actually not a bad neighborhood to live in. However, as the map shows, the Navajo were forced to move farther east, away from their homeland. What was the fate of the Navajo? The National Museum of the American Indians is located in Washington, D.C. Trip Across went to this museum to find out the story of William Sherman's agreement with Navajo leaders. On the morning of the 1868 talks, Barboncito makes a prediction about the outcome of the talks. He then goes to the negotiating table and says to William Sherman, "I hope to God you will not ask me to go to any other country except my own." It might turn out to be another Bosque Redondo. He was saying that no matter how much more livable Oklahoma was, we wanted to go back to our own barren land. William Sherman thinks about this for a moment and replies, "You are right. All people love the country where they were born and raised." Barboncito and the Navajo cheered. In fact, in the morning, Barboncito made a point and said, "We're going back home." Now the Diné are going home. And so are the Ende. They are going home in reverse. It's a long walk home. Let's listen to Manolito's words. "The day we were to start, we went a little way toward home, because we were so anxious. We told the drivers to whip up the mules, we were in such a hurry. When we saw the top of the mountain from Albuquerque, we wondered if it was our mountain, and we felt like talking to the ground, we loved it so." And some of the old men and the old woman cried with joy when they reached their homes. It wasn't all joy. Some people encountered rivers and drowned in their haste to cross. The words of one Navajo girl Trip Across met come to mind. "We like to run and play basketball the most. But we can't swim. We never learned." One of the conditions of their return was to send Navajo children to American boarding schools for at least 10 years. Manolito and other leaders' children were sent to American boarding schools. Native boarding schools had problems, with many children dying of tuberculosis and other infectious diseases. The boarding schools were soon abolished. Since then, the Navajo people have lived hard. They defended the land they returned to and worked to reclaim other lands. This map shows how much the Navajo Nation has expanded through negotiations with the U.S. government. This is the land that was returned in the 1868 treaty with Sherman, and it's now 5 times larger than that. The Navajo tribe is now the largest indigenous people in the United States. They are also one of the few tribes that have retained their land, language, and culture. Narbona, Manolito's father-in-law, is said to have emphasized to Manolito the importance of peace and negotiation, not just fighting. The Navajo people have had wise leaders who knew when to fight and when to back down, who negotiated with tenacity, and all of the Navajo people who persevered. Now the Navajo people are doing great as Americans and as global citizens. Native Americans, including the Navajo, were very active as code talkers in World War II. The Germans and Japanese couldn't understand what Native Americans were saying. The National Museum of the American Indians had photos of Navajo code talkers who served in the Korean War. We are deeply grateful to them. That concludes our trip across story for today. Thank you.